Thank you very much, Henry Smith, for joining us on this interview for the APPG on issues affecting men and boys. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and say how you got into Parliament and your motivations.
My name is Henry Smith. I'm the Member of Parliament for Crawley in Sussex. I've been a Member of Parliament since 2010. My motivation for being in public life is I want to hopefully make a positive difference in the community and the world that is around me. Before going into national politics, I was a local authority, a county leader. I have been an elected representative for a fair amount of time. And when the Men and Boys All-Party Parliamentary Group was established fairly recently, it was one I wanted to become involved with, because I have certainly seen, representing a relatively working class community, how particularly boys in that environment often don't get the attention that other groups in our society do.
Okay, so I noticed that you were one of the very first people to sign up to the APPG. So that was your motivation, is primarily the what you see as the outcomes for boys in your constituency.
Yes, I mean, I obviously have a lot of casework from residents in my constituency, and I did notice that there is more of a prevalence, particularly, as I say, boys and young men from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds struggling with education, struggling in the work environment, perhaps getting housing, social housing, in all sorts of areas. Also, their experience of the criminal justice system as well, and policing. And so I noticed that there was a trend in the casework I was getting, that there was a section of society, typically white working class boys actually, and young men, who weren't receiving the attention that other more deprived members of the community have done traditionally. And therefore I think that needs to be discussed, and there needs to be a focus on that area.
Oh, that's fantastic. You've asked a number of questions, parliamentary questions, on education. What's been your experience of doing that?
Well, education is, I think, absolutely key. I think support for all young people in education, regardless of their background, is important. If that intervention to support people, again, particularly from more deprived backgrounds, doesn't happen at an early age, then it really is a precursor for all sorts of worse problems, not only for those individuals, but society in general. And that's why I've tabled a number of questions in this area in Parliament. And I have to say that the sort of responses I get are fairly, if I'm being sort of charitable, are fairly complacent, I think, from the Department for Education. I won't say that the issues are fobbed off, but it isn't clearly an area of focus as much as I believe it should be by the Department for Education and other bodies that are responsible for delivering education for our young people.
Yes, I think I noticed that that you got roughly the same response, which was we don't target policies towards a particular group. We just try to raise the game for everybody. And as a former teacher myself, I think, well, that's just going to enshrine the differences. If you just try to raise the game for everybody, then the people who will benefit most are the people who are already benefiting, and that we need some specific intervention, not necessarily primarily with boys, but with those who underachieve, who are predominantly boys. I mean, certainly when I was teaching, you look in the top set and it's equal boys and girls. You look in the bottom set and it's 80% boys. So do you think that we need more targeted intervention for boys in education?
Yes, I do. And I think, as you correctly say, I believe the current response from the Department for Education and, as I say, other bodies responsible for delivering schooling is very much, well, we seek to assist everybody, and it's almost an inertia response. Well, clearly that's not working, because the figures show that boys do tend to fall behind much more easily. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that, but the importance is, first of all, to recognise that fact, and then to have some targeted intervention. And it's not true of the Department for Education or any other body to say that they don't engage in targeted intervention. Certainly peoples from ethnic minority backgrounds have had particular additional support, girls as well. And I'm not decrying any of that. All of that is important, but it shouldn't be to the detriment of those who don't fall into those categories. And so, yes, where there's a problem, there needs to be a focus on that to try and address it and rectify it.
Yes, it's almost as if society has got it into its head that boys are privileged and therefore they don't need any help. Perhaps.
I think that's part of the problem, in that traditionally in our society, yes, men and boys were much more dominant in terms of their role in society. But that was quite some generations ago now. And I think there is sort of an assumption that still men and boys are in a situation as our society used to be. And that really largely isn't the case anymore. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we have much more equality. I'm not saying we have complete equality, but we have much more equality in our society. That's something that represents great progress. But that shouldn't mean that the issues that affect, particularly, I think, men and boys from deprived backgrounds, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't receive the targeted intervention that they need, so that they can be productive members of society when they grow up.
Well, that's fantastic. If we can just change subject to perceived bias in Parliament. Certainly when those of us who are interested in men's issues look at the parliamentary process, it does seem to be quite biased against men. For instance, when we looked at the domestic abuse bill, when it was going through its committee stages, the only people invited to give evidence were those representing female victims. And there is a violence against women and girls strategy, but no strategy for men and boys, despite the fact that there are more victims who are male. Obviously it's male on male, but there's a women's health strategy, there's a minister for women. Looking at from the outside, it looks like nobody cares about men and boys.
Well, yes, and I would argue that that actually goes against equality. There is a Minister for Women and Equalities. I think that should be a Minister for Equalities, period. I think it's almost an oxymoron saying that you're seeking equality and then individually sectioning out a part of society for particular treatment. So I think that is as I say, slightly counterintuitive, and I think in some quarters of Parliament and government there is hostility, but I think more prevalent is really just neglect of issues affecting men and boys, and sometimes actually a sort of sense of awkwardness that if we talk about this, it's not very politically correct, and therefore it's a bit of an awkward subject, and therefore we won't mention it. And I think there's quite a lot of that. So, but that doesn't help people who are in an adversely affected situation. When it comes to domestic violence or violence in general, yes, it is true to say that women are certainly in the domestic setting are more likely to be the victims of domestic violence, but there's a large minority of men who are victims of domestic violence, and just to sort of airbrush over that actually again isn't helpful for solving the problem. So this isn't about giving sort of women special treatment or men's special treatment or certain individuals from different ethnic backgrounds special treatment. This is ensuring that original desire to have equality across the piece, because that will lead to a better society. If we start leaving sections out or not including them, then actually that just stores up problems for the future, and I would argue potentially makes resentment and problems going forward much worse.
Mm. When we challenged the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who enforced the Equalities Act on these issues, they told us that it didn't infringe the Equalities Act, because in the Act it's possible to intervene on the behalf of a disadvantaged group. And that was the reason why things like Minister for Women and Violence Against Women and Girls didn't breach the Act. Do you think that that's a problematic interpretation?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with targeting specific groups or a specific problem. If there's a problem facing our country or our society, then it's important that there's a particular focus to try and solve that. But the way you solve that isn't by excluding others. I've got no problem with particular focuses to address situations, but that shouldn't be to the neglect of others in society. And I think that's the point, that sort of judgment from the Equalities Commission is missing.
Mm. So you've been in Parliament since 2010. Do you think the situation, if you like, the atmosphere, culture, is moving in favour of talking about men's issues more? Are you optimistic, or do you think that things are staying the same or getting worse?
Well, I'm not hugely optimistic. I think things probably at best have stayed the same. The one thing I would say is that at least some of the sort of figures showing how certain sections of men and boys in our society are being left behind, particularly in education, that is beginning to be slightly more acknowledged, and the very fact that an all-party parliamentary group has been established is, I think, a very important step as well, representing obviously different political backgrounds, and of course men and women on that group as well. So I think there's been a little bit of progress, but there's a lot further to go, I would suggest.
Okay, yes. What we found interesting was that, having started the APPG, lots of men's issues people said, "Oh, what a remarkable achievement," and those of us who set it up go, well, all we did was write to everybody 2 or 3 times. It's not like we pulled any levers. It's obvious that there was a kind of interest there already, but it just hadn't been tapped. So
I think outside of the Westminster bubble, this is a concern to most people in society. Obviously, men and boys are part of most people's lives. People have husbands, brothers, sons, uncles, cousins, and nephews, and so forth. And the thought that they would be left behind or not receive fair treatment, I think, is something that most people think is wrong. So absolutely, I think the rebalancing of society over the last several generations to be much more equal is important, but that shouldn't exclude a key section of society, and that's why I think this group is very important.
Mm. So would you say that the sort of relative neglect of men's issues is simply for the reasons that you have given, that people are just a bit reticent or don't know about it? Or do you receive any, as it were, instructions from above about not covering issues?
Well, there's certainly no overt instruction from above, as you say, but I think certainly there is a reticence of people maybe to address these issues, and I think there's an element of the pendulum swinging from one extreme to another. So several generations ago, women and girls in our society didn't receive the respect or the equality that should be due to every human being in our society. And a lot of measures were taken to counteract that, and that was right. But as I say, I think maybe the pendulum swings too far, and then the net result of that is actually a neglect, particularly of boys and young men from working class backgrounds who perhaps don't have the voice in our society that should be listened to, and therefore it's perhaps easier to ignore them. So I do think this is, as I said earlier, there is some hostility, absolutely. But I do think this is sort of neglect, or this is a slightly uncomfortable, awkward subjects, and therefore, let's talk about things that are less awkward.
Well, let's hope that sort of interviews like this could make people feel less uncomfortable, because I'm sure you. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that if you talk to ordinary people in your constituency, they, as you say, they are concerned about their brothers and fathers and uncles and male friends and whatever, and they don't think that the men in their life are the evil people that some paint us all as.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a sort of a dangerous assumption, actually, that sort of all men are sort of tendency to sort of violence or misogyny. I certainly, of course, that exists, but I don't think that is certainly by any means a majority of men. I think it's a very small minority, and to sort of paint the majority of men and boys with the bad behaviour and unacceptable behaviour of a minority, I think is a lazy assumption and is very wrong. But also, I think the inequality comes not only in our education system but in our health system as well. So absolutely, it's right that there has been a focus on things like addressing cervical cancer, and there is screening, of course, for every woman in the country. But that isn't the same case with a very prolific cancer, prostate cancer, for example. There isn't routine screening on that. Now, that's just plainly wrong. If we are to have cancer screening, it shouldn't be, and of course there are some cancers that affect men and some that affect women, but both, to use that example, should be the result of screening. It shouldn't just be weighted to one section of our society.
So one of the things the APPG has just been working on is a men's health strategy, which is to recognise, as we do with women, that there are some illnesses which are specific to one sex, and also there are some illnesses where men or women are predominantly the victims. So is a men's health strategy something that you support?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I support a health strategy, and I support a screening strategy for health, but that shouldn't be weighted to one section of society against another. I think actually one of the ways that we can improve health outcomes and not put so much pressure on our NHS in the future is to have a screening program, whether that be breast cancer or whether that be prostate cancer, or any others. So I think a strategy that looks to address these common conditions that people get across both sexes is absolutely right. And I also think there's perhaps an additional issue here, in that traditionally men aren't very good when they're feeling unwell, or they perhaps pick up symptoms, but actually going to the doctor to to have that investigated. So I think even more reason why a sort of screening program where people are invited to come forward for a scan or blood test or whatever the nature of the screening is important to prevent future disease and morbidity, and you know, that's a benefit to our society and our economy more generally.
That's great. One of the things that we noted in the men's health strategy is that it's not so much that men are hesitant to go, it's that they're at work. Or and for instance, we heard example from the Irish experience of a men's health strategy, that simply taking heart screening to farmers' markets found that farmers were very, very willing to participate in the screening program for their heart disease. They were just too busy on the farm. And similarly, we heard from Andy's Man Club that when you actually create an environment which men feel they can speak, then Andy's Man Club have tripled the number of groups over the last 18 months because they found the right formula which fits with the way men do things. So that feels very hopeful.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you know, our health system should be responding to the way people live their lives. So you know, if you're going to work from sort of 8 in the morning to 6 at night, well, it's important that either health screening comes to places of work, or there are appointments available before and after and at the weekends, for example, traditionally when people aren't at work. So you know, just to have appointments available during work hours means, you know, those people who do work long hours have a even less chance of being treated. And I think certainly the Irish example that you state is a very good one indeed. And I'll also mention mental health as well. I think there are issues where, you know, traditionally perhaps men haven't been as good at talking about their feelings as women are. And in my constituency, there's an initiative called the Men's Shed, where men, and I know it's up and down the country, where it's a sort of a place really for men to get together, to chat over a cup of tea, you know, do a few practical jobs if they want to, a bit of carpentry, maybe a bit of, I don't know, rewiring some equipment or something, you know, quote unquote, sort of very sort of traditional masculine sort of things to do, but at the same time have an opportunity just to talk. And I think often, you know, men don't have that opportunity. So initiatives like that, I think are very important.
There's an interesting,
and perhaps more so since the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course has kept people separated.
There's a phrase which I quite like, this, which is women communicate face to face, but men communicate shoulder to shoulder. And I think that encapsulates that idea of the men's shed. Is you go along to do a bit of carpentry, and in the process of doing the carpentry, you chat about stuff. You don't, as men don't go and sit down in a room and face each other and say, let's talk about my feelings.
I think that's, I think broadly speaking that's right. Men and women do tend to have a different way of engaging with each other. You know, I take the train pretty much every day into work, and I'm always struck that when two women are traveling together, the conversation will flow the whole journey. When I see two men traveling together, it's the odd comment here and there, and you know, there's obviously nothing wrong with both of that, but I do think perhaps men maybe need to have their feelings, as a general point, more sort of coaxed out of them, and in settings where they're likely to talk, rather than, as you say, sort of face to face, when I think a lot of men maybe even subconsciously feel a bit awkward in that environment.
Okay, so if we can move on to being more effective. What advice would you give to those who are interested in men's issues to be more effective in creating change?
Well, I think it's very important that if people have concerns about men's issues, that they speak to their members of parliament, their elected representatives, and let them know that. You know, a large part of each of my days is taken up answering correspondence from people, and people aren't shy to write on issues, and I find out about what people's concerns are, where problems are, when people highlight issues to me. And I think that people concerned about deprivation and men and boys falling behind need to articulate those and ask their elected representatives what they're doing to represent them and seek to address those issues. I think the best thing to do is to engage in dialogue and ask questions. I think to take the attitude, oh, it's a bit of a controversial or an awkward subject, therefore I won't say anything, just perpetuates the problem.
One of the experiences or the widespread view shared among people working on these issues is that they write to their MP and they don't get a reply, or they get such a bland reply and they become disillusioned. What do you think they should do?
Well, I can't speak for other members of parliament. I try to give a comprehensive reply to correspondence that I get in, but of course, inevitably, some people don't like the response that they have got, and you know there are genuine differences of opinion that we'll have to sort of respectfully agree to disagree. So it's not just about I think writing to your MP, but I think a discussion about concerns around men and boys falling behind, whether that be in education or in healthcare, or not receiving the attention for issues that exist. I think we need to talk about it more and not feel awkward about it.
We've only just been going for not quite a year in the APPG, and so the first issue we did a general report on the state of what it's like for a boy today growing up in the UK, and we've just done our first report on men's health strategy, and perhaps later on in the year we might do boys' education. And these two issues are relatively uncontroversial. Nobody thinks that men should have worse health or that they should have worse learning, but there are some more controversial issues, such as a strong feeling that the family court is hostile to fathers, for example, and that the prison sentencing is grossly unfair to men, that they spend, you know, at least twice as long in prison for the same offence. Do you think it'll be possible for us to address these issues, or do you think they'll be just too controversial?
Well, as you say, I think the easier ones are educational attainment, our health qualities, and those are, I think, less controversial, although still get some pushback, I have to say. But you're right, when it comes to the family court system or the criminal justice system, I mean, there is a clear bias against men in that, and that is clearly wrong. Where people are seeking justice, that should be given equally. The symbol of justice is a blindfolded woman holding a set of scales, and that is how justice should be. But it's not actually how justice operates, and it's not just inequalities for men, but other parts of society as well. So I don't think we should shy away from addressing these issues. The facts and figures speak for themselves, I think.
Okay, my final question is about how to make the APPG more effective. What we've done is a fairly traditional thing. We've listened to, we've had speakers, and we've written a report and published the report and tried to get some publicity for it. But one of my feelings is that this isn't really going to change things, that to change things requires some other process. Can you advise us on how to be as effective as possible running the APPG?
Well, I think the APPG is an excellent start, and for a group that's been going just about a year, the reports already produced, I think, have made an impact. But you're right; it's not just about reports that are written and then perhaps sit on a shelf, and it's not just about parliamentary questions, although it's important that those continue. I think really. Highlighting the concerns being raised by the APPG in the media is important as well, and we've talked about perhaps a lack of attention from government and Parliament, but I think the media also needs to address these issues and there to be a wider discussion. So I think reaching out and applying our concerns on these issues to whole sort of society-wide issues is very important. That this isn't about favouring men or boys. This is about equality, and actually this is about if we want a better society and a more cohesive and productive country, then we shouldn't be neglecting sections of it in the way the policy is made and services are delivered.
Do you think we should perhaps be focusing more towards persuading people like you to have quiet words with the minister, if you like, backroom approach, rather than the sort of front room, here's our report, how about it, minister?
Well, that's how Parliament works. There's the sort of public questions that are on the official record, and debates and so forth, where speeches are made and you get a ministerial response. But also Parliament works by bumping into somebody in the lobby and saying, I'm really concerned about this issue. Please, will you pursue it? Can we talk about it some more? So that does go on as well. But it's important to get things on the official record as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Henry. That's been very helpful.
Well, it's my pleasure, and my thanks to you and the whole team for the Men and Boys All-Party Parliamentary Group for the work that you do. It's very important, I think.
Okay, thank you.